Well, I know many of you have been following the various farmer protests in Europe very, very closely. We heard some great news last week that it seems like there was some progress, some breakthrough, perhaps some concessions. However, I wanted to get someone on who's really been following this very, very closely. He can help us to unpack the different groups of farmers, the different demands, the different countries, because it's not just a single movement. There is quite a lot of detail and nuance to what's going on. So I brought on none other than Bill Wirtz. Bill, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been following this very, very closely. You've been actually doing a little bit of media and talking about this and helping, for example, people like myself over here in Australia to try and wrap my head around what is going on. There is a bit of a perception in Australia that all the farmers are rising up for the same reasons and what they want is their freedom. I wish it was that easy, but it's not though, is it?
It's a lot more complicated and it varies quite significantly between which country you're talking about.
Mm.
In the Netherlands, it's environmental regulation. In Germany, it's tax reasons for taxes on diesel.
Mm-hmm.
In France, it's everything almost, so everything from trade to negotiations with retailers. In
Mm.
Central and Eastern Europe, it's about trade with Ukraine and the price of wheat coming out of Ukraine. There's a lot of different reasons. I think the uniting factor is the fact that farmers feel disenfranchised and not listened to by a lot of the policymakers that make those environmental policies, essentially blaming the reason, putting the reason for why we have problems in terms of why we need climate change action,
Mm.
putting all of that responsibility on the farmer. And I think that is really fueling the protests.
To what degree are these protests focused at the European Union as a sort of a federated body, and to what degree is their ire being directed towards their own national governments?
So it's a mix. It's interesting because in some countries, farmers are simultaneously protesting in their capital cities and then also moving to Brussels, which is where the European Union's institutions are located, to protest bureaucracy at that level as well. Because farmers do understand that even though there is some leeway for member states of the European Union to change policies, a lot of the things that they're protesting against are made in Brussels, are made on an EU level. And the member states can't actually really influence that policy unless there's policy changes on an EU level. So they often do both. It depends on how close you are to that border and how easy it is to get to Belgium with your tractor.
Mm.
But ultimately, they do protest on both levels. And interestingly, they're also having impacts locally on some of the environmental regulations that countries try to implement, and the Netherlands was a good example.
Mm. Well, these protests have often been quite deliberately disruptive, quite deliberately provocative. What's the level of public support? I mean, we're seeing scenes here. There's been extraordinary things, obviously, the dumping of produce onto highways to block them. We saw a blockade around Paris. We've seen manure being spilled onto the streets. We've seen fires being lit in some places. Obviously, again, this is all disparate activity happening in different parts of Europe. What's the public mood like? Are they enjoying a lot of popular support, or is the disruption perhaps eroding that?
They are enjoying a lot of support. And what was so interesting in Germany is that even though they were blocking the roads in and out of major cities and making a lot of people late for work, 80% of people in Germany, even those that are not associated with the agricultural sector whatsoever, were supportive of the protest. The same was
Wow.
true in the Netherlands. The same is true in France. So this is really having political repercussions. And I think one of the reasons for that is because what people see in terms of their energy bills, energy prices going up because of environmental policies,
Sure.
they say, okay, well, the farmers must be mad for the same reason, so we are supporting them. So there's really been a shift over the last few years in Europe on environmental policy. In 2019, if you took a selfie with Greta Thunberg as a politician, it was a boost for your campaign. Now nobody would touch that issue.
Mm. No, it is interesting, and certainly getting the common man, the city dweller, to identify themselves with farming issues is something that I've been trying to do here in Australia around irrigation water restrictions that have happened, that have very much harmed our irrigation sector in my region of Australia. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, and if you're right that that's actually what's driving the sympathies here, then that could become quite a powerful political voting bloc. Now, speaking of politics, I want to talk about what's been happening with the Dutch farmers recently. They actually organised and formed a political party, and they've had some considerable success. Do you put that down to the success of the protests feeding politics, or is that a separate issue?
So the provincial election in the Netherlands was in early 2023 and really followed the protests, and overwhelmingly people voted for a farmers' party. I mean, a party that actually did exist previously, but was a very, very small party, and
Sure.
suddenly had the success where the only way the government could actually approve policy and get it through the Dutch Senate, so the provincial elections essentially get people elect members for the Senate,
Mm.
was if they had the approval of the Farmers Party. And then the government fell for different reasons reasons, and there were new elections, and now the Farmers' Party is in coalition talks to be even part of the national government, which
Yeah,
means
wow.
that a Farmers' Party is now on the level of, maybe having the agricultural minister
Mm,
as one of their portfolios.
mm,
So what we see is that as politics has made farming more political, farmers have politicized as well. And
yeah.
so this is really has led farmers to say, okay, there's only so much we can do in terms of protest. We might have to become active politically as well, which comes with its own challenges. I mean, there's been a lot
Sure.
of debate over what are the policies of those farmer parties on other issues, and sometimes they don't really know because they're not political animals. They're
Mm,
not
mm.
made for this world, and so they run into difficulties on that front as well. We've seen that in the Netherlands, but ultimately, what we see now is that Dutch farmers have organized politically and have been successful.
Well, an agricultural minister who actually comes from agriculture, what will they think of next? That would be quite an extraordinary thing to see. Now, we have seen recently some celebrations, claims that these protests are working, that concessions have been made. What can you tell us about that? Are these EU level concessions? Are they substantial? Does this really represent a win, or are they just clutching at straws here?
They're on both ends. So in Germany, for instance, the government made concessions on the taxes on diesel, has said that it's going to phase out the exemption over time. The farmers are still protesting to get a complete repeal of that rule, but there have already been concessions.
Hmm.
And one of the biggest concessions right now from the European Union has been that the pesticide reduction law, which was one of the cornerstones of the European Green Deal, which was cutting pesticide use by 50% by 2030,
Mm.
that has been scrapped completely.
Wow.
And that was one of the big policies that they wanted to pass. And they said, okay, in the current climate, we can't do it. So what in the upcoming European election in June, environmental policies are going to be one of the driving factors. They were one of the driving factors in 2019, but for very different reasons. Now
Sure.
there's opposition to it. So it's going to be on one of the top line issues on top of energy security and security altogether in Europe, environmental policies being on the chopping block. Yeah.
Well, essentially a referendum on these environmental policies. It's going to be very, very interesting to see whether more countries in Europe head in the same direction as what the Netherlands did at their last general election. Well, Bill Wirtz, thank you so much for helping us to wrap our heads around this relatively detailed and complex issue. I'm certainly backing the farmers. I want to see them win enormous concessions, and hopefully they will stick to their guns and do exactly that. Bill Wirtz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.